A unique aspect of this church is that it faced east, faced away from what's now County Route 8. This church was built 1814. I'll show you in a moment where the first Reformed church was. This was built 1814. It's in service until 1880, when the church moved to its present site on Church Avenue. This church was dismantled in 1880, piece by piece, and rebuilt on the Miller farm in Lithgow, and served as a second life as a barn, and was just torn down in the last 10 years or so. The other unique aspect here is not well known is that there was a side road that led up to the front of the church. That's not there anymore. And it looks to me like there may have been a little creek there where there's burials now. This is another view of the second church on the hill where the cemetery is now. That's the driveway in front there. That's where people would
up as high as low, I guess.
So people would have come up by horse and wagon, come up to the front of the church here. The stables, I believe, were down over here on the east side of the church. There's, we'll talk about the graves that are there now. But this is the way the church looked most of the time that it was there. Like I said, only in service from 1814 to 1880, so relatively short-lived. The original location of the Reformed church was down on Sharp's Landing Road, what we call it today, Sharp's Landing Road. First reference to the Reformed church is in 1726, and they got their first minister, Reverend Van Driesen, came to Germantown in 1728. The sign says the first church was built in 1728. It was probably a little bit after that. And, according to the sign, it's 500 feet west of 9G and the southern end of Sharp's Landing Road. You can tell that that picture is a little dated itself because there's a bus at the old bus garage where the diner sits now. There's a drawing from Walter Miller's book. He took the likeness from the 1798 Legram map and made a representation of what he thought the first Reformed church would have looked like. You can see the cemetery there. I don't know if that road really corresponds to anything that's there currently, but you can see the graves on the side there. All right, so one of the things I teased in the description for this cemetery walk and talk was, where is the body of Reverend Gerhard Daniel Koch? He came to town. He was a minister of the Reformed Church in Germantown from 1763 till his death in 1791. He's the first minister who basically spends his whole career here at the Germantown Reformed Church. He was the reverend of the church when the parsonage on Maple Avenue was built in 1767. His wife lived in a house across Maple Avenue after his death for the rest of her life. She lived out across the road from the parsonage. And it was always a little bit of a mystery until into the 1900s of where he was buried. It was said at the time he was buried under the pulpit of the church. And he died in 1791 before the church moved up to the hill. So he was originally buried under the first Reformed church on Sharp's Landing Road. And now when that church was dismantled in 1814 and the church moved up to its second location on the hill, apparently his body was moved up to there and buried under the pulpit of the Second Reformed Church. That wasn't known for sure by later generations until the Second Reformed Church was dismantled in 1880. And for a time, there was a reverend named Brogan Hoff. He preached in the 1850s at the Second Reformed Church. He was also buried under the pulpit of the Second Reformed Church, but he was from New Jersey originally, and his body was later removed and reburied in his family plot in New Jersey. So when the church was dismantled in 1880, Reverend Cox's body was uncovered, and this is according to Reverend Freer, who was preaching for the Reformed Church in the 1920s and into the 30s a little bit. I believe he confirmed the story to Walt Miller that his body is still there under the site of the pulpit of the Second Reformed Church. And after the church moved down to Church Avenue, that became where the church became a place, kind of like a premier spot to be buried. So the people who are buried where the church was are among the most prominent people at the time, from the late 1880s into the 19-teens. And Reverend Cox's burial was disturbed again in the early 19-teens when someone was being buried there. And I think we have a pretty good guess who it was. I'll mention him again later. He's towards the end of the discussion. But I'm going to start with headstones. I'll start all the way on the far end over by the maintenance building, what we call the older half of the cemetery. This is Henry Person. He's a African-American gentleman born in the first few years of the 19th century. Died in 1863. He's notable for the fact that he purchased the Maple Avenue parsonage from a man, another African-American gentleman named Harry Moore. He purchased the parsonage in 1851, and that would become the Person House from 1851 until the last Person family member died in 1911. That's his wife, Mary Barber. Now, I haven't seen a record, but it's a pretty good guess that she was born into slavery. She was born in 1804, and the Barber family was enslaved in Claremont, in the town of Claremont, New York, and pretty good possibility that she was born into slavery. New York State had a very gradual emancipation law passed in the last year or two of the 18th century, and full emancipation didn't take effect until 1827. These are three of their children: Jeremiah, Mary, and Emma. Emma Persons, all the kids added the S. On their parents' gravestones, there's no S at the end, and all their kids have Persons. So the Person. Emma, there on the bottom, is the last person who owned the parsonage. After she passed away in 1911, it was sold into the Finger family, where it stayed until the Edward and Friedel Eckert purchased in the mid 1940s. Now there's the maintenance building of the cemetery. The other notable thing here, these are all black families that I've highlighted so far, they're on the other side of the driveway. So, in a way, it's a segregated section of the cemetery, but and that's what I always thought from the time I was a little boy, walking the cemetery. I'm less convinced of that now. I'll explain when I get to some of the more prominent people here in the cemetery who are pretty close by to this section. But first, highlight Theodore Robinson. He was so this Robinson family had a connection to Catskill, and likely that he was born there in 1839. The Robinsons become a big part of the Maple Avenue African American community. So the Person family from 1851 till 1911 is based out of the Maple Avenue, what was the Maple Avenue parsonage. And the Robinson house was located at off the end of Maple Avenue Extension, what we call today Maple Avenue Extension. It was just a little bit west of the very end of Maple Avenue Extension. If you get permission from the property owner and go back in the wood line behind the house that's at the end of the road there now, you can see the ruins of the foundation for the Robinson house. Theodore Robinson fought the Civil War. He enlisted in a USCT regiment in 1864, and he was known to lead the Memorial Day parade through Germantown in his later years. And I don't know what exactly he died of, but in a newspaper article from January 1907, the same year that he died, mentioned that he lost his right hand in a corn cutter. So, he was right in that Maple Avenue African American community is right, on the edge of several farms at the time. The land immediately to the north is still undeveloped. That was a big farm at the time. But Theodore Robinson, for the most part, was what I call a boatman. He made his living fishing, shipping. There's many different tasks on the river that fall under the blanket of boatman. That's the Robinson house there at the end of Maple Avenue Extension that I mentioned earlier. This is a photograph of a wedding, and we're not 100% sure who any of the people in this photograph are, but make a half guess that the old man there in the second row may be Theodore Robinson. We do have also have a schoolhouse picture. I'll be on the next slide. And those are a couple of Theodore Robinson's daughters, or one son, one daughter. Son is standing in the third row, and his daughter is all the way at the right in the second row. And one other thing I'll mention about Theodore Robinson, his grandmother was a woman named Diana Sharp. Don't know for sure, but pretty good inference that she was born into slavery, enslaved by the Sharp family, the name that she carried the rest of her life. She was born, if I have it correct, she was born in the 1760s, and she was still alive and on the 1875 New York State Census at the age of 107 years old, living with the Robinsons. And then just one other brief note. So Peter Sharp, who would have been the last Sharp of that line to own slaves, He lived on off the Sharps Landing extension near where Moore Road goes west from the road. On the 1820 census, like I said, New York had a very gradual emancipation law. In the 1820 census, it's a little remarkable because Peter Sharp still has 6 slaves. And on all the previous census federal census from 1798 to 1820, the most any one person has is 6 slaves. So it's a little bit remarkable that Peter Sharp still had 6 slaves, because anybody born after in that time frame from 1798 to 1820 is going to be free beyond a certain age, and then beyond a certain point they're just born free. So it's pretty remarkable that Peter Sharp had 6 slaves still in 1820. Now this is really not that far away. This is just on the other side of the driveway, and there's only 2 circular plots in the whole Reformed cemetery here, and this man here, Josiah Nisker, his wife Mary Rockefeller. Josiah Nisker is a very prominent man in Germantown history. I believe it's fair to say he had his choice of burial plots, and he's buried very, very close by to the African American section of the cemetery, which it leads me to believe that my old idea that that's a completely segregated section or very stone's throw away may not be completely true. But Josiah Nisker, he was a very political man. He was in the freight business. He's made his living running ships primarily. He also played a big hand in getting passenger rail service to what we now call Lower Main Street. His house is near the end of Young America Road. I'll show you a picture of it here in a little bit. The other thing, I don't want to get too far off onto Lower Main Street because we're talking about it next month, but Lower Main Street, almost everybody on Lower Main Street is either born a Rockefeller or married a Rockefeller. For a long time, well into the 20th century, it was almost the only way you're going to get a house on Lower Main Street, or what's now Young America Road. Josiah Nisker is a Palatine name. Josiah Nisker was born in Carlisle, the town of Carlisle in Schoharie County, and he is a great grandson of Johann Peter Nisker, who was an original Palatine. Who lived in Hunterstown section of Germantown, what's now Cheviot. Johann Peter Nisker was among the Palatines who left for Schoharie in 1712. And just like there were 4 Palatine villages in what's now Germantown, there were 8 Palatine villages along the Schoharie Creek, where they settled in 1712. And one of those 8 villages is called Niskerndorf. And that there's still a Niskern Road out there today. And he came from a pretty prominent family in the Schoharie Valley. I don't know what drew him back to Germantown. His business of choice was freight, though, so it did make sense to live right on the Hudson River. Show you a picture. This here is you can see the circular burial plot is one of 2 circular lots in the entire cemetery. This is a survey map of the cemetery from August 1960, and you can see where the old driveway was there. There's a section, you can see the new driveway, the current driveway at the very top of the picture, and then the driveway prior to 1960 labeled there, and all the newer graves of the last 15, 20 years are in that section in between the two driveways. I'll be honest, I'll say I'm 90% sure that this is a picture of Josiah Nisker and his wife, Mary Rockefeller. I will know for sure by the time I present Lower Main Street next month. Like I said, he was a very political man and a Democrat his entire life, before, during, and after the Civil War. He was a town supervisor, he was a town clerk, justice. The highest he got was he served 1 year as a New York State Assemblyman. They had 2 children. This is where he lived. This is 36 Young America Road. The part of the house that juts off to the right there was built in the 1860s, and the other half of that house is a bit older. Josiah Nisker lived there with his wife. Is from, I don't know exactly when, but at least 1850s on till the end of his life. Like I said, Josiah and Mary Nisker had 2 children. Their son, Frank, one of his 3 children was named Henry Parsons Nisker. This is a photograph of him. He, from what I understand, he lived in New London, Connecticut, but he was a traveling salesman. So he would go all over the country. He died in Arkansas, Pulaski, Arkansas, of a ruptured hernia. And like I said, referencing his grandparents' photo, I'm 90% sure that that's them. I chose him and his story because it's one of the few pictures in the Nisker album in the history department that's actually labeled. I could say for sure that that's who that is. Moving on just a little bit further off is the Disher Sipperly gravestone. Massa P. Disher, just talk about him briefly. He was a prominent lawyer in town. If you search the newspapers, you'll get endless amount of results because his name is on many of the legal notices in the Columbia Republican for many years. He lived a pretty long life, 1869, I believe, died in the early 1940s. His parents were immigrants from Germany, and they very much fit into the second wave of the later wave of German immigrants to Germantown. It was not really a wave; it's more like a trickle. But some of these families of German ancestry are relatively new to Germantown, and Disher is one of them. Sipperly, on the other hand, is an old Palatine name, often spelled with a Z instead of an S in the early days. I don't have a good portrait of a Massa P. Disher. I know there must be one hiding here somewhere. This is a picture of the elders and deacons of the Reformed Church, I believe from 1928. Reverend Freer, who I mentioned earlier, is in the middle of the front row. Massa P. Disher is all the way off to the right in the back row. That's the best picture I've got of a Massa Disher. Many other big players in town history here in this photograph Abram Rockefeller, Henry Lawrence. We'll talk about some of them as we move on here. Now, this is just a very short walk from the Niskayuna plot. A man named Martin Van Buren DeWitt. You don't come across a name like that unless one or both of your parents are into politics. And just on the other side of that gravestone are his parents. Don't have his mother's name at the tip of my tongue, but his father's name is William H. DeWitt. Owned a store in the corner of Maple Avenue and Main Street. Just recently, a few months ago, got a letter donated, a very cranky letter that he wrote to the Postmaster General, demanding to know why Philip Rockefeller had become the Postmaster General, and essentially stole or swooped in and got the post contract for Germantown away from William Overbaugh, who's also buried in the cemetery. I don't have a picture of. But very cranky letter written by this man's father, very politically active. His father, William H. DeWitt, was also town justice for many years as well. Martin Van Buren DeWitt was a Civil War soldier. I believe I have this information here. So this is a screenshot from the unit roster of the 128th New York Infantry. That regiment was composed of men from Columbia and Dutchess County. And you can see some of Martin's exploits there, handful of promotions there. So of the men of the 128th, of those men, the ones who are wounded, typically there's 2 dates, and one of those 2 dates is the date that Martin Van Buren DeWitt was wounded. He's wounded in action at the Battle of Cedar Creek, September 19th, 1864. Several men were captured and taken prisoner at that battle. That was not the case for Martin Van Buren DeWitt. But those are like the 2 really big battles that the 128th was involved in, and he was wounded at. Now, not too far away is the gravestone of Andrew Jackson Tenbrook and his wife Julia Winans. If you're picking up a theme, I think it's fair to say that at least in this section of the cemetery, you can kind of tell which political party was most favored in this era of Germantown history. And nothing particularly remarkable about Andrew Jackson Tenbrook. I show his stone here as to eliminate one other aspect of Germantown history. There are 2 small family cemeteries in North Germantown. One we call the Tenbrook Cemetery, somewhat still there. It's in an island of trees in the Heller farm field. It's just east of the northern end of Hoover Avenue. Stones are still there. I don't think there's any still standing up, but they're still there in those trees. And there's trees there because it was a cemetery and it was a pain in the neck to keep the weeds down, and that's why it's a bunch of trees in the middle of a farm field. There's also a Winans cemetery, or was a Winans cemetery on Northern Boulevard, right in the backyard of a house that someone lives in now, in the middle of Northern Boulevard. One of the old roads that went down to the anchorage was called Winans Road, and I believe it went up to the old farm where that family plot is. These folks lived well into the 20th century, but at the time they were born, there still would have been people being buried in both of those family cemeteries. this is another family that goes back to the 1710 Palatines. Jeremiah Dick, likely the builder of what we call the Dick House. It still stands. It's at the corner of Eastern Parkway and County Route 8. That's his son, Peter H. Dick. A little, I won't belabor you with that whole thing. That's biography of Peter H. Dick, the son. Talks a little bit about his parents there. Again, one of those tales where the family had to hide the spoons and hide the silver when the British came close in 1777. And I'll show you the gravestone of his grandfather, who was a Revolutionary War vet. This is from a published around 1900. It was kind of like a who's who around town, published by the Hudson Gazette, I believe. And it's a good primary source on the Dick House. The farm was originally 500 acres, and it gives a brief description of what they did for a living. That is a son of Peter. And then there's the father of Jeremiah Dick. Yeah, lived to be 86 years old, Revolutionary War vet. And his wife also lived even longer. 94 years old, died in 1862. Now there, I jumped ahead a little bit in space. Those graves are in the what would have been the old churchyard. Like these are in the section of the cemetery where people would have been buried while the second church existed. So it's a pretty noticeable change in the cemetery as you get closer to where the church was. So one of the main differences you'll notice walking this cemetery as opposed to the Viewmont Cemetery associated with the Viewmont Lutheran Church. There's really not that many ministers of the Reformed Church buried in the Reformed Cemetery, whereas if you go to Viewmont, there's many of the ministers of the Viewmont Lutheran Church. Spent their whole career at Viewmont, and two chose to be buried at Viewmont. And this is the rare minister who elected to be buried in Germantown. He spent a good chunk of his career. I think he was here 10, 15 years maybe, but he was minister of the church when the church decided to move down to Church Avenue, its current location. And like I said, there's Reverend Koch and Reverend Wyckoff are the only two that I know of, two ministers that I know of who are still buried in the Reformed Cemetery. Rogan Hoff, who I mentioned at the beginning, his body was initially buried under the pulpit of the second church and then later moved to his family plot. This is one of the more interesting characters in the New York regiment from Germantown and Columbia County. This is James Portland. He was a farm laborer, born in Ireland. You can see the dates there. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he was working on the farm of Philip H. Rockefeller, and died pretty young of a heart attack. He was living in Livingston when he passed away in the 1870s. He's buried very close to the burial plot of Philip H. Rockefeller. Um, it's very tedious trying to figure out which Philip Rockefeller it is in the cemetery. There's at least 15 Philip Rockefellers in the cemetery, but I think it's a pretty good bet that the Philip Rockefeller that James Portland is buried next to is the one whose farm he was working on when the war broke out. It's kind of hidden there, but May 27th, 1863, he was wounded in action at Port Hudson, Louisiana, and that's the other major combat that the 128th Regiment saw. They were essentially trying to storm the fortress on Port Hudson, Louisiana, on the Mississippi River. It was unsuccessful there in May of 1863. Port Hudson actually fell after Vicksburg. After Vicksburg fell July 4th, 1863, the Confederates decided to abandon Port Hudson several days later. There's the Philip H. Rockefeller I mentioned, is very nearby James Portland's grave. And let me go back for a second. James Portland, his gravestone, I believe, is a government issued gravestone similar to Theodore Robinson's gravestone and similar to some people I'm going to show you later on. His gravestone's been broken at least once. There, it's not in the best shape, and that's the case. You really can't read Theodore Robinson's gravestone. We really got to. You can make out Portland. That's about it on James Portland's gravestone. And that's the case with all the guys who served in the 128th who got government issued gravestones. Is they're wearing out. They're almost illegible in most cases. There's Eugene Van Cortlandt Myers. Most people know him as a photographer. He took many pictures of Germantown. Many of the great photographs that I use came from him. He captured an era of the town history that otherwise would have been completely lost. So many of the buildings that were key to town life in the 19th century are gone. And the only way we know what they looked like are from Court Myers' photographs. His a little bit of, I don't want to say mysterious, but murky historical record related to Eugene Van Cortlandt Myers. On his gravestone there, if you look close, it says 128th Volunteers. But if you go to the unit roster, he's not there in the 128th. So he was born up in Rensselaer County, and he did fight in the Civil War. He was actually wounded at Petersburg in 1864. June 1864. He actually fought in the 125th Regiment. He was married. I don't believe he had any children. So it's possible that whoever in charge of giving the engraver the information had it wrong. He was associated with Germantown for many years. And they may have just assumed that he was in the 128th. Like I said, he was wounded. That's another murky aspect of his historical record. One record says he was wounded severely in the left forearm, and then another record from the post-war years says that he was wounded in his left calf. But in either case, he was wounded. Not in the first attempt to take Petersburg, Virginia, in June of 1864, but I believe a week or so after the first attempt. I believe involved in the Jerusalem Plank Road action. That's how most of you know Court Myers is from his photographs. And that you'll see that print sometimes on the front of the picture as well. But that's what he's most known for. I apologize for that one on the left there, but so these, I believe, were stamps, templates in a way. If you look really close in the top middle of both of these, you can see Court Myers Maker. Now, one of the other ways that Court Myers made his living, he was also a dealer in firearms and ammunition, and this was a way that he could engrave his name and the names of many other people there. I don't have a picture of it with me now, but I have recently seen a rifle that he made that says Court Myers Maker right on the barrel of the gun. And these stencils and also the gun were found in the barn at 44 Main Street, often called the Weber House. It was built by Captain Phil Rockefeller, who I'll talk about later in the program. Thomas Finger is a farmer. His farm was off of 9G, near the northern end of Sharp's Landing Road, primarily on the east side of what's now 9G. 9G is not created until the 1930s, but his farm was in that vicinity. His house stood on the footprint of the First Lutheran Church. You'll see that historic sign as you drive by it on 9G. And his wife there, Juliana Schulteis. Schulteis is a somewhat rare name to see in the Reformed cemetery. Family is more commonly associated with the Lutheran Church. The old Schulteis farmstead from the 18th century was located pretty close to where Thomas Finger's farm was. And I bring them up because I want to talk a little bit more in detail about their son, James. It's James Conrad Finger and his wife, Margaret Dick. She was a little bit younger than him, but she died about 20 years before he did. And it's hard to read, but at the very bottom says, "Weep not, she is not dead, but sleepeth," which is, you can get a sense for the grief that James Conrad Finger went through by losing his wife relatively young. James Conrad Finger lived to be 77 years old. Passed away in 1907, I believe it says there. James Conrad Finger also lived in in his father's house there on the footprint of the First Lutheran Cemetery. He's known to history primarily because he's responsible for destroying the First Lutheran Cemetery. It would have been right in the side yard of his house, and extending for some distance to the west as well. And there's a couple of old stories that circulate. I talked about them a little bit on the Lost Graveyard Zoom talk I did last year. Regardless, he's responsible for knocking all the stones down, and some of the stones were recovered when 9G was cut into the bank there in the 1930s. Some of the stones and some burials as well. The other thing that's mentioned about James Finger is he was sued by the Lutheran Church for knocking down all of the graves, and the church won the lawsuit, but the graves never got put back in place where they should have been. Here's a interesting burial. I don't know a whole lot about this gentleman other than I believe he was born in Kingston. His name's Monsborough Bloxham. And you can, for a military, there's absolutely no chance the military is going to spell that correctly, and they didn't. He was discharged with the proper spelling of his name, but in the unit roster for the 80th New York, the other notable thing you'll see there, he's wounded in action. He doesn't give the day, but in one of the 3 days battle at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in July 1863. He's not a 1/28th guy, but he outlives almost all of the other Germantown veterans of the Civil War. There's another 1/28th gentleman as well. Don't know a whole lot about him, but he's another gentleman with a government issue headstone. It's almost completely illegible now at this point. Henry Brundage. Many of you know these folks. These are the Eckerts. Mrs. Eckert there was born in France, of German descent. Mr. Eckert was born in Germany. Mr. Eckert, they lived on Long Island. Mr. Eckert was a executive in the Chiclet Corporation, and his primary job there was he was the head of the division that was tasked with spraying the candy coating onto the outside of Chiclet gum. And so his first wife died under pretty tragic circumstances as a result of a car crash in I want to say 1933. And he and his second wife Friedel bought the parsonage in 1943, 44, somewhere in there from, can't think of the first name, but the Finger who bought the parsonage from Emma Person, who died, from the estate of Emma Person, who died in 1911. I have a few pictures to go along here, but they, tremendous, like it says, historians and benefactors of Germantown, and they're tremendous benefactors to the town of Germantown. They're responsible for giving the original 24 acres that are Palatine Park now. They gave that to the town. They also gave the parsonage to the town. Fixed it up, one, because it was pretty much about ready to fall down in 1944 when they bought the place. And after their passing, gave the parsonage to the town as well. This is around the 1976 bicentennial celebration. This is the dedication of Palatine Park. The historic sign that still stands there now near the war monuments. That's Mrs. Eckert on the left and Mr. Eckert in the middle there. That's a parsonage. I believe the date on that picture is 1945. So that's before they really get working in earnest on the parsonage. It looks like they did some site work at that point, but you can see just how open the land was, because all that land was still being used for agriculture at that point. The Eckerts owned much of that acreage behind the parsonage as well at that time. And you can see far background of that photograph, you can make out the old road that connected Camp Creek Road to Maple Avenue. Another notable thing to point out, you can see there's a far right of this photograph, there's a driveway where there's stairs leading up to the parsonage. And also the historic sign, which would date from 1932, is kind of like in the dead middle of where the house lot, whereas now it's over, would be off to the far right of the photograph today. And there's another view of the parsonage at the time, 1945. The kitchen, they tore that kitchen off. Apparently it was too damaged, and it doesn't look like somebody more than 5.5 feet tall can stand up in it either. But you can see some of the condition issues there. It looks like there's a roll roof on the western half of the house, and then I'd imagine there's problems with that chimney over the old kitchen. And there's harvest time. The Eckerts did do quite a bit of farming in their younger days. They had plenty of acreage to do it on. They had Mr. Eckert, like I said, his first wife died in a car crash, a result of being hit by a truck, in which the brakes failed, and Mr. Eckert successfully sued the manufacturer of the brakes, and presumably got a windfall settlement from that. And I believe that windfall is what he used to purchase up the land that he bought in Germantown at that time. And the other notable thing here too is there's a couple of the old privy, and there's an old shed right nearby it that I believe they survived until 1990 or so, and the town knocked them down because they were pretty much falling down at the time. You can still see the foundation. The foundation for the privy is in the backyard there still. So, I'll bring this up later, but you'll see Christopher C. Kuhn with no S. You would commonly see an S nowadays on the end of that last name. Let's skip ahead one frame. He was in business with Edmund Rockefeller here. They were the proprietors of the Ice House that was located between Cheviot and Lower Main Street. I believe they incorporated in 1882, and Mr. Rockefeller here, Edmund Rockefeller, passed away in around 1910, and the family, his descendants, sold off the Ice House piece by piece. It was never. It was the least productive ice house of the three that we had in Germantown. The shallows around the Cheviot area make it so that the river ice kind of is not really ideal for cutting ice. It kind of flakes, it freezes in a kind of haphazard way, I believe, because of the shallows. So this was the least productive of the three ice houses. Didn't last very long. It was going for maybe 30 years. The town owns the site now, and you can still see the ruins in parts of that parcel. You can still see a lot of brick. I believe they used brick for the footings of the ice house. All the lumber got sold off at the time, 1913, shortly after Mr. Rockefeller here passed away. And those are some of the children of Edmund Rockefeller and his wife Lorinda. One of their, I'm not sure if she's on the stone. I'm not sure if she's a child of Edmund and Lorinda or a grandchild. But Julia Rockefeller, there on the bottom there, born in late 1890s. She was in the Marines, and she was a little bit old to be serving in combat in World War II, but she was in the service during World War II, and she was the only female member of the armed forces from Germantown who was active in World War II. She lived on Main Street. I believe she died in 1977, 78. I'm sure a lot of people on this call remember her. From what I understand, the way she died is she went to let her dog out, and the door locked behind her, and it was a freezing cold day like today, and just couldn't get back inside and froze to death. Now, William Meade, that's pretty substantial obelisk, and I show him and another Meade grave nearby. Now, this is another family that had their own personal family graveyard in Germantown. No signs of it anymore. This one, the Meade Cemetery, was also on the very northern tip of Hover Avenue. There's some different theories. It may have been part of the same family complex as the Tenbrook Cemetery. It was some distance away from the Tenbrook Cemetery, so there was some separation there. But it's hard to say because all the stones are gone from the cemetery. They may still be there in the mud, but otherwise it's completely gone. We do have some records of the burials at the Meade Cemetery, but otherwise it's completely obliterated. You wouldn't know that it was ever a cemetery. And so now we're getting close to the church site. These are fairly old graves. These are people who would have been buried when the second church was active. John Rouse, the Revolutionary War veteran, his wife Eve. Peter Lawrence, I believe he's the first Lawrence in Germantown. His descendants would play a very big part in later Germantown history, and we'll highlight them shortly. He's a Revolutionary War vet as well. Peter Bloss, another Revolutionary War vet. That's a name you'll see a few different spellings. Plass is common as well. Elias Finger, not a Revolutionary War vet, but a War of 1812 veteran. His headstone was replaced by the family. Now, getting very close to the old church site, and this is Andrew Hover. Now, if you watched my Chevy talk last year, you'll know that date very well, March 26, 1845. I can't think of any worse day in all the history of Germantown. He's the oldest of the 9 people who drowned in the boat accident off of East Camp. It wasn't even called Chevy yet. This is before the train even came through town. Andrew Hover. Interesting that his gravestone is spelled Hover, whereas in almost all of his records, he goes by the older spelling of Hover, Hawer. Is a prominent town attorney. And this is a daughter of George and Margaret Rockefeller, who were also in the boat accident of 1845. They're buried here. George and Margaret Rockefeller. Their daughter Emmeline also perished in that accident. George Rockefeller is another one of these guys that held every office there is to hold in local government, including town supervisor. He and his wife Margaret are buried here somewhere nearby, but I don't believe their stone exists anymore. If it is, it was knocked over long ago. The Ramonzo Hover is another. He was a farmer. Do have a photograph or two of him. Yeah, his wife is a miller. Is also, a very big, big players in the history of our town. That's Ramonzo Hover. And there's Ramonzo, the old man seated there. There's 4 generations of millers there. And the little girl there, 8-month-old girl, Virginia Miller, is, her married name was Sherwood. And I'm sure some of you have the pamphlet called Early Life in Germantown, New York. That was written by Virginia Miller. That's her memories of growing up in the old times of Germantown. And she's the little baby in that photograph there. Philip William Rockefeller Jr. This is the man we call Captain Phil. He was born 1824, died 1910. He was a riverboat captain who's not involved in the military. That's where that name captain comes from. He was a riverboat captain for most of the 1850s and into the 1860s a little bit. Again, another guy that held almost every office that town government has to offer. His house is 44 Main Street, still there today. At that time had a cupola. Otherwise looks pretty similar to the way it does now. That's a photograph taken by Court Myers, and that's at the time that a man named Harry George lived there. Harry George also a town supervisor in his time. But I don't want to glaze over Captain Phil too much, but I will talk more about him next month at the Lower Main Street talk. Like I said, riverboat captain, also responsible for building the Riverside Seminary, which was located where the bank building is now, right at the corner of 9G and Lower Main. The Riverside Seminary was a private Reformed primary and secondary school. It only lasted a few years. There was an ordained Reformed minister was brought in to be the principal of the school, and he would preach on Saturdays and Sundays, and he would draw bigger crowds than the Reformed minister on the Hill was getting in the 1860s. And the minister didn't like that, and a lot of the old timers in the church didn't like that. And there was essentially like a whisper campaign started, and hounded this gentleman who ran the Riverside Seminary out of town. So the Riverside Seminary only lasted a few years. Afterwards, the building was used as the Mountain View House, a resort hotel, and I've talked about it in some of my Instagram and Facebook posts recently. That burned in 1910, and Captain Phil died shortly after that. after the hotel burned down. So this is Philip William Rockefeller III. That was his son. His wife's Margaret Miller. We do have a few pictures of them. This is down Lower Main Street by the railroad tracks. You'll see some of the storehouses in the background. Philip William Rockefeller III is all the way to the left there. His wife, Margaret Miller, is next to him, just to the right. There they are again, Philip William Rockefeller III and his wife, Margaret Miller. Presumably their wedding. Looks like a very uncomfortable corset. They lived on Lower Main Street as well. Nowadays it'd be two lots uphill from their father, or from his father's house. That house is still there. I don't know if the owner of the house is on the call or not. But, that house is still there, minus most of those trees. More Lower Main Street Rockefellers, who I'll cover in more detail next month. The Pulver, like I said earlier, there's for 150 or more years, the only way you would see another last name other than Rockefeller in that Lower Main Street area is if somebody married a Rockefeller woman. That's the case here with the Pulver family. Don't have a picture of Lewis, but I do have a picture of his wife, Rosanna Rockefeller. That's her there. And that's the house they lived in. That's 44 Young America Road, right just east of 44 Main Street. At that time, it was the residence of Tompkins Coons, and another photograph by Court Myers. Just on the other side of the obelisk there, where Philip William Rockefeller III, you have the inscriptions for Harold Oakley Denninger and Leila B. Rockefeller Denninger, his wife. Harold Oakley Denninger was the postmaster of Germantown for many years. There's a picture of them at their house. They lived in they lived in the house that her father built, Philip William Rockefeller III. They lived in that house. Oops. Isaac Pulver Rockefeller, born 1851, died in 1910. I'll talk more about him next month as well. Another player on Lower Main Street. There's a couple of pictures of him, relatively young, relatively old. He had a storehouse down what we call Lower Main Street now. Sold lumber, coal, a little bit of everything. There's, a lot of the proprietors of these river landings sold pretty much anything. His store is right there, is in the background, one of the previous photographs I showed you, and it's there on the right in that photograph. Funk Road. It comes down to the railroad tracks, just north, just beyond that store. And that's Isaac and his wife Kate. These are the graves of Walt Miller. I mentioned Harold Oakley Denninger. He was Walter Virgil Miller's boss at the post office for in many years. And this here is the plot for Walter Virgil Miller, longtime town of Germantown historian, longtime Columbia County historian, and his wife Margaretta Vermillier Mickle Miller. That's a picture of Walt. Walter Miller is the second from the left, tallest guy there. Relatively young picture of him, and Harold Oakley Deniger, the postmaster at the time, is all the way to the right. That is when the post office was in building on the corner of Maple and Main Street, so just opposite of G-Tel, across Maple Avenue from G-Tel. There, Walter Miller is an older man all the way to the left, and I love this picture because there's so many great people in it, and they're in the parlor of the Maple Avenue parsonage, and I believe this is the 1976 bicentennial committee. Left to right there is Walter Miller, who was the historian at the time, Raymond Crawford, Elaine Lipschitz. The young guy there is Charles Ramsey, who recently passed away, and Helen Henderson is the next one, and Mr. Edward Eckert, all the way to the right. And Walt Miller's grave is part of, so we're a little bit east of the church site. We're over in the area that was probably horse stables for the church. Every church before automobiles would have big, long horse stables in order to accommodate anyone coming from further, anyone who couldn't walk to church, wasn't close enough to walk to church, would have to take a horse. So this is in the area of the horse stables. Walt Miller is buried here, and from here you can see kind of two lines of graves going all the way out to the road, and it's part of the greater Mickle family plot. All of these people from here to the road are descendant, in some way married into the Mickle family, if not direct descendants. And there's the stone, the Mickle stone, close to County Route 8. And the graves there, you see a flag. It's for Isaac Mickle, who was in the 128th Regiment, and his wife Jane Vermillier. And there they are, Isaac Mickle and Jane Vermillier. They're the only direct family that I'm discussing here tonight. I have a lot of family in this cemetery. These are a pair of my great-great-grandparents. And so there's a picture of him taken in New Orleans in 1862. He's part of the 128th. He's also wounded in May 1863 in the assault on Port Hudson, the unsuccessful assault on Port Hudson. He was shot through both thighs. You know that for sure from records. According to family legend, he was told that both legs needed to be amputated, but he refused to have them amputated. And luckily he did, because he survived the wounds. The bullets went in and out of both thighs. And he made his way back to health after he recovered. He was put into what's called the Corps d'Afrique, which was the precursor of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops. So he was a sergeant in the Corps d'Afrique. So essentially a minor command role of a black regiment in New Orleans. Their initial task was to be used as guards to police New Orleans, which was occupied by the Union Army relatively early in the war, and later commanded the USCT uh, troop that grew out of the Corps d'Afrique. Um, I'm not sure if he ever rejoined the 128th. It's a little fuzzy in the records, so I don't know if he was at Cedar Creek. I kind of lose track of where he was in the war. But when my great aunt had to go into the nursing home, probably 10 or more years ago now, she uncovered 5 letters that he had written home from Louisiana during the war. And I have those all translated, and I'll share those publicly soon. But for now, if you look at the middle of that page that's there, it says this is a piece of rebel paper. So the letters, there's a lot of the usual 19th century letter stuff. Hi, how are you? When are you going to write me back? But there is a lot of interesting anecdotes from life during the war in Louisiana. As one of his comrades from the 128th, George Funk, another guy with a government issue headstone that's illegible almost completely now. So the notable thing here from his war record is he's transferred to the Veteran Reserve Corps only a month after enlisting. Veteran Reserve Corps is sometimes called the Invalid Corps. So not really sure why, but for whatever reason, he was not able to to be in a full duty combat corps. So the Veteran Reserve Corps would do stuff like dig defensive works around some of the border state cities like Washington, D.C. And George Funk here was sent to Harrisburg, which I believe had some fortifications as well. So it was essentially light duty, guard duty type of thing. And most of the 128th soldiers mustered out altogether in Savannah, Georgia in 1865. He mustered out with the Veteran Reserve Corps that he was part of in Elmira, New York, where there was a prison camp. There were, on the site of there were the regiments from out there in Elmira trained along the Chemung River, and then that site was later used for the relatively notorious prison camp located there along the Chemung River. And then the most prominent and the most long-lived veteran of the 128th was a man named Charles H. Hover. He actually has two gravestones, including the obelisk there. Picture of him there. Relatively young guy when he enlists, only 19. He was another guy who was involved at Cedar Creek, October 1864, in the Shenandoah Valley. He was captured and taken prisoner, and served for some time in Salisbury Confederate prison camp in North Carolina. And he would recount, he lived a long time after the war. He passed away in 1926, I believe. And he would recount stories of, you'd pay so and so much for like the bone of a dog that accidentally snuck anywhere near the camp. So you'd break the dog bone. It would cost a fortune just to get a bone that you would like break into pieces and boil, and you get a little bit of bone marrow soup out of it. And rats were a delicacy. He mentioned, it's all kinds of the horrors of war he was witness to and recorded. And for some reason in the 128th unit roster, they use that spelling of Hover, Hauver. It's really the only place I see that spelling. Is more common more common old spelling of Hover is Hawer. For some reason, all the Hovers in the 128th are spelled that way. So now we're up to the only other. So Josiah Niskanen has one of the circular plots in the cemetery, and this is the other circular plot. This is located about where the church was. So we're over top of where the pulpit would have been. We're about where Reverend Gerhard Daniel Koch is buried, unmarked. There's no marker for him anywhere here, but he's buried somewhere in the ballpark of the circular plot. And like I said, this was kind of like the premier spot to be buried for a time. After the second church was dismantled in 1880, all the people buried here are very prominent people at the time. The most prominent among them is Erastus Coons, and he is buried under that obelisk, the tall obelisk there. See him there. He was, another one of these guys that held every office, including town supervisor. He's also a lawyer. You'll see him in legal documents all through Germantown for decades and decades. And is a surveyor as well. Many of the waterfront maps that we use now, in town committees active now, many of the maps that we use now were drawn by Erastus Coons. He's also a poet. There's a picture of him there at his house on Hilltop Road, named after the house. His house is called Hilltop. That I live a little snippet of his poetry there. That's a 4-page long poem, and I only put the 4th page on there. But oddly enough, he's writing about graveyards. The feelings that he would get walking through a graveyard. And that's his house there. That's Farview. That's on Hilltop Road. So Hilltop Road, at the time Erastus Coons built this house, it was there before Hilltop Road connected all the way through from Dalesbridge to County Road 8. The entrance to Farview, the original entrance to Farview, was down on Hover Avenue, which is a relatively new road itself. It's slightly newer than Hilltop Road. Hilltop Road, at the time this house was built, did not connect all the way through. But this was, I think it's hard to beat this view anywhere in Germantown. There's the front view of the house. It's been altered quite a bit over the years, but it's still recognizable. There's a kind of stylized drawing. A couple of things. There's no Taconic Farms. There's hardly any other houses, and that's probably about right for the time that Farview was built in the late 1800s. And there was an orchard there going down to today's Hover Avenue, but gives you an idea of what town looked like in that era. Now there's many Lawrences in the Reformed Cemetery. I dare say that Henry Arthur Lawrence is most important. Born 1852, died in 1828, I believe. His wife is a Rockefeller, and I think one of his great grandparents was a Rockefeller. He ended up the Rockefellers are associated with Main Street up and down from the river all the way out to Claremont from the mid 1700s right on through into the early and even mid 1900s. And I'm not 100% sure how the line of descent worked, but he wound up owning three of the corners of 9G and Main Street. He inherited the old house of Philip D. Rockefeller, born 1746, son of Deal Rockefeller, the immigrant Rockefeller. He inherited Philip D. Rockefeller's house, which is on the northeast corner where Stort's is now. Knocked down that house, didn't like it, built this around 1911. I think is the year we've kind of settled on, because there was a newspaper discovered when this house was moved down to Crawford Lane. That, like I said, that's the corner of 9G and Main Street. That's the corner that Stort's is on now. And now, the name that most of you probably recognize as being the Lawrence name is the Lawrence brothers. Henry and Lyle Lawrence were the sons of Henry Arthur Lawrence and Augusta Rockefeller. Lyle lived here until he passed away. After their parents died, Henry and Lyle, the Lawrence brothers, they paid for the gates at the entrance of the cemetery, and the plaque on the one side, is another dedication to their parents. Henry and Lyle, the Lawrence brothers, they sold a little bit of everything. Most prominently cars. They were one of the early car dealers in Germantown. There's one of their advertisements there. They sold Fords. They sold other brands as well, but Fords were their big sellers. They were also wholesalers of fruit. In their time, there was a lot more agricultural activity going on in Germantown, primarily fruit of all varieties, especially apples. One of the other businesses they got into, it was insurance, and the building that we call the bank building now started its life as the Lawrence-Boyce Insurance, Lawrence-Boyce Insurance Company. There's a man, another pretty important guy in early 20th century Germantown history, Randolph Bloom, better known as Rudy Bloom, started a mechanic shop in 1901, according to a biography that Walt Miller put together. He bought this old blacksmith shop and store here. Bought this in 1914, I believe. This is on Main Street, just a little bit east of Church Avenue. This is on the south side of Main Street. There's an apartment there now where these buildings were. It's debatable whether parts of those buildings were kind of mashed into the buildings that are there now. But anyway, Rudy Bloom operated his automotive shop here from 1914 until he retired in the 1930s. And his place was the leading hangout for the men in town. Rudy Bloom, you'll see his picture there. He's the second from the left there. There's on the bottom right of the screen, you see a list of the gentlemen there. It's a little bit of a cross section of the people in town, but people would go and just hang out at his shop, and in this newspaper caption, the discussions range from Europe's war to the Yankees' chances in the American League. And one last veteran of the 128th outlived most of his comrades, is Henry Sipperly. And I don't know too much about him, but luckily for him, he has a pretty nice headstone that's held up over the years. All right. No, I don't have time tonight to do the so-called new half of the cemetery on the other side of County Route 8. But I did want to share some news about the first Reformed cemetery, which is in this little triangle of land on the road to the right is Sharp's Landing Road extension. The road to the left is Sharp's Landing Road. And in that little triangle of land lies the cemetery for the First Reformed Church. And this is land. I don't think it's ever been privately owned. It's belonged to the town since the church moved up to the hill where the cemetery is now. And the Hoover Foundation we mentioned earlier has awarded a grant to the history department in the library to put up a monument at the site for the First Reformed Church cemetery. And we're designing it now, and hopefully it'll be installed in the springtime. And if you have questions or want to donate pictures or anything, any questions of any kind, you can email us at germantownhistory@gmail.com. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at Germantown History, or you can check out our website, germantownnyhistory.org.
Shannon just let everyone read.
And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. If you're more comfortable typing the question, you can type it into the chat function.
Don't forget, next month, Lower Main Street, February 24th at 6:30. So the flyers will go up in a couple days. No questions? A lot of information to absorb.
They knew that coming into this. I think.
Yeah. How's your eyesight? Can you read that? It's pretty good. A lot of thank yous. Great job. Well, we appreciate everybody attending tonight. We had a great turnout. Who was in the Revolution? Who was the parents? Oh, Peter Glass. Sorry, Peter Glass. Who?
I don't know offhand. I'd have to look and get back to you, Bruce.
Just when I focus, things get blurry and like Polar Express, Peter Bliss. All right, well, thank you guys for everything, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks a lot.